Trump signed an executive order increasing tariff on Canada from 25% to 35%.
But we have made a few deals today that are excellent deals for the country. You know, we're taking in literally trillions of dollars for the country.
This is the moment when America's closest friend finally said enough, and the consequences have shaken global markets. While Trump was still busy pounding his chest in triumph, a new kind of economic war quietly broke out overnight. And that is what truly matters. Not Beijing, not Moscow. It erupted right across the world's longest peaceful border. Canada, yes, Canada itself, has just launched what is now being called the fiercest counterstrike in modern trade history. No bombs, no missiles. The weapons this time were contracts, pipelines, and a move that economists describe as checkmate. Trump thought a few tariffs would bring Canada to its knees, but Mark Carney has turned one of America's closest relationships into one of its heaviest burdens. And what is unfolding now is not just a matter of trade retaliation. This is the moment when America's vast economic web turned into the knife at its own throat. August 1st, 2025, in the dead of night, Trump signed it. Import tariffs on Canadian goods jumped from 25% to 35%. From Washington's perspective, this looked like the same old show of force, America flexing its power once again to dominate its smaller neighbor. Everything seemed as usual, but not this time. So what happened next? No one in Washington could have predicted what was coming. In less than 3 days, Canada did more than simply respond. It changed the entire game. No fiery press conferences, no defiant speeches, just one ice-cold move calculated to the smallest detail, now being called the economic nuclear button. And you felt the blow before you even knew what had happened. That $6.98 kid's hoodie at Walmart? Now $10.98. Your morning coffee, nearly half again as much. A weekend getaway to Montreal or Toronto? Forget it. This was the real pain. 1/3 of Canadians stopped crossing the border altogether. Think that's just pocket change? Think again. Florida alone depends on 3.4 million Canadian visitors every year to stay afloat. And they don't just come for fun. They are the lifeblood of local economies. They rent long-term condos. They buy cars. They dine out. They play sports. They pour more than $6 billion into the state every year during the winter months alone. But in 2025, they vanished. Condos stood empty. Restaurants shut down. Local mayors went on television begging Washington for help. And Ottawa? Not a threat. Not a shout. Just a silence that chilled to the bone. And that's when it hit me. This isn't about tariffs. This isn't about tough talk. This is economic war, and for the first time in modern history, America is the one on the back foot. Think of it this way. You live in a quiet neighborhood. One day, the neighbor across the street decides to start charging you every time you borrow their lawnmower. Instead of yelling or getting angry, you quietly buy a new one, join forces with other neighbors, and from that day forward, you ignore them completely. The only difference here? That lawnmower isn't $200 at Home Depot. It's a trade system worth nearly $850 billion a year. For decades, relations between Canada and the United States were so seamless, they were almost boring. Factories straddling both sides of the border, a shared power grid, and supply chains so intertwined that a single auto part might cross back and forth as many as 7 times before becoming part of a finished vehicle. The Canada-US border, long and nearly barrier-free, was more than symbolic. It was the backbone of North America's prosperity. And then, with just 5 words, Trump shattered it all. When he smirked and said Canada was nothing more than the 51st state, it was like lighting a fuse. Canadians did not take it as a joke. It was a declaration that, in Washington's eyes, Canada was no longer a partner but a possession to be managed. That very night, the quiet neighbor, trusted for so long, turned into an unknown factor that could no longer be underestimated. From that moment on, everything changed. Sitting in the Prime Minister's chair in Ottawa was no traditional politician. It was Mark Carney, who had steered the Bank of Canada, then the Bank of England. He had coordinated the global financial crisis response in 2008, helped Britain weather the Brexit shock, and waged currency wars without ever needing to raise his voice on television. While Trump threw tariffs around like a schoolyard test of strength, believing Canada would quickly back down, Carney was setting a much deeper game. He did not strike back loudly or impulsively. He chose patience, built resilience, and quietly rebuilt the pillars of the economy. And sooner or later, the United States would stumble under the weight of its own making. Phase 1, the pivot. In just 12 months, between May 2024 and May 2025, Canada cut its export share to the US from 78% down to 68%, a full 10-point drop in a single year. A number no economist had ever thought possible. So where did all those goods go? Gold exports to the United Kingdom surged by more than 470%. Trade with the European Union rocketed upward. Mexico, Japan, Australia, almost overnight, all were drawn into Canada's new orbit of strategic partnerships. But that was just the surface. The real move was still to come. Phase 2, playing the resource card. Canada is not just maple trees and lumber. It is home to some of the largest untapped reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements in the world. The very substances buried underground are what make iPhones work, keep electric vehicles moving, and allow America's defense industry to keep breathing. And the crucial fact, China controls up to 80% of global rare earth refining. But Canada is different. Not only do we hold the resources, we also have a stable democracy, something the US cannot find elsewhere. Mark Carney seized the moment. When Trump swung his tariffs, Ottawa did not scream back. Instead, Canada rushed through a wave of mining permits, poured investment into domestic processing plants, and signed supply contracts with its closest allies. We were no longer just shipping out raw ore. We were selling refined, ready-to-use materials, bypassing Beijing entirely. And by then, the Pentagon was starting to panic. The US Department of Defense has already had to pour $500 million into projects designed to reduce dependence on China. But those projects will take years before they come online. And Canada, we can deliver as early as next week. That is no accident, it is a calculated strategic strike. Now think about the things you use every day: the phone in your pocket, the laptop on your desk, the charger plugged into the wall, every EV charging station on the street, every wind turbine spinning to generate clean electricity. They all rely on materials that come from one of two places: authoritarian China or democratic Canada. And when I say dependence, I am not exaggerating. The entire US defense industrial supply chain, from satellites to radar systems to F-35 fighter jets, cannot be built without those rare earths. No rare earths, no military technology. And here's the ultimate irony. Trump has just slapped tariffs on the only country that can genuinely help the United States escape Beijing's grip. Think about that. The sole reliable source of critical materials lies in a democratic ally. And with one impulsive decision, Washington turned its back on that source. Let that sink in. But Carney did not sit still. For anyone who thought tariffs would make Canada flinch, he countered with what I would call a polite offensive. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford began openly denouncing companies that exploited consumer trust, slapping a Canadian flag on products not made here. Without protests or political grandstanding, the slogan "Buy Ontario, Choose Canada" spread like wildfire. Not just a call to action, but a collective movement. Not out of anger, out of pride. And that is what Carney understood better than anyone else. Instead of shouting at America or pointing fingers at Washington, Canadians chose to look inward, to tighten ranks, to reinforce domestic confidence. This was not simply economics, it was a form of resistance through spirit, quiet but incredibly effective. Because every Canadian dollar spent at home became an invisible strike against Trump's tariffs. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, American households began to feel the pinch. Car prices climbed by 4 to 8%. Footwear soared by 40%. Clothing jumped nearly 40% as well. Even Walmart, famous for its low prices, had to admit that rising costs were inevitable. And Ford Motor Company, they had already lost close to $1 billion to tariffs in just a few short months. Procter & Gamble tried to hold out, but eventually had no choice but to raise prices on essentials like soap, shampoo, and toothpaste. This was no longer a Wall Street problem. It was a direct hit to the wallets of everyday Americans. And that's when the story took an unexpected turn. By shutting the door on Canada, Trump quietly cracked it open for China. He announced a 90-day suspension of tariffs on Beijing. Think about it. The United States was facing off against China, its #1 strategic competitor, yet handed them a 3-month golden window to regroup. Meanwhile, its most reliable ally, Canada, was hit with the highest tariffs ever, and China wasted no time. In those 90 days, Beijing expanded tariff incentives to dozens of African nations, shoring up its power in global supply chains while Washington scrambled. They still controlled rare earth refining. They still held the backbone of modern technology. And now they had more partners than ever before. What was the result? The United States effectively handed its rival a chance to recover, while at the same time turning its fire on its most trusted friend. A move that was both dangerous and self-defeating strategically and morally. And here is the part Trump never anticipated. Carney spotted the flaw in his opponent's strategy and exploited it with remarkable subtlety. What is unfolding is no longer just a tariff skirmish. It is a clear sign that North America's economic bonds are fraying at an alarming pace. And the concern is that it does not end with tariffs. The USMCA, the very foundation of US-Canada trade, is now hanging by a thread. Trump's team began threatening to reopen negotiations, brandishing tariffs like a baseball bat. But they did not expect Canada's response. Far from breaking, Canada has tilted the rules of the game in its favor. Though its economy is much smaller than America's, it has shown an extraordinary resilience. Why? Because Canada's banking system is regarded as the most stable in the world. Because Canada's resources look like the future's shopping list. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, materials everyone is scrambling for. And while Trump antagonized his allies, other countries were lining up to shake hands with Ottawa. Washington, meanwhile, was slowly coming to terms with its real dependence on its northern neighbor. From the aluminium in beer cans, to the energy powering factories, to the auto parts keeping Detroit alive, it all flows from Canada. The irony is stark. Every time supply chains were disrupted, American industries suffered just as badly, sometimes worse than Canada's. Trump's tariff strikes did not land as he had hoped. On the contrary, states like Michigan, New York, Washington, and Montana bore the brunt. Job losses, higher costs, and crushing pressure on local businesses. Lawmakers from these states soon found themselves cornered, as both voters and business leaders raised their voices against the chaos in supply chains. Trump had vowed to teach Canada a lesson. But in the end, it was ordinary Americans, the very people who voted for him, who were paying the price. And this was the masterstroke Carney had been quietly orchestrating. The story was no longer about tariffs. The real key was minerals. While the world argued about import percentages, Canada was quietly advancing a plan to redraw the entire global map of resource power. Yes, this was not a mere adjustment of trade policy, but a wholesale reconfiguration of how the world operates around strategic raw materials. Picture the future: renewable energy, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, defense technologies, all dependent on lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. And where are they found? Canada has them in abundance,